The story of the Atlantic slave trade begins in the 15th century, when European powers were expanding their reach across the globe in search of wealth and resources. As colonies in the Americas grew, so did the demand for labor that was harsh, unending, and desperately needed to cultivate sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. European traders saw a grim opportunity in this demand, turning to the African continent to supply workers who would endure unimaginable hardships to fuel the booming colonial economies. This trade was not just a transaction of goods, but a system that uprooted millions of lives, forcing people from their homes and communities across the ocean into a life of servitude. Ships left African ports crowded with men, women, and children, bound together in tight quarters, facing weeks of perilous travel, disease, malnutrition, and despair were constant companions. And yet, countless individuals survived, displaying resilience and courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped entire continents. It enriched European nations, transformed economies, and left an enduring mark on societies around the world. Its effects can still be felt today in cultural legacies, social structures, and ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Understanding this history is crucial not just to remember the past, but to recognize the strength, resistance, and humanity of those who endured it. If you want to uncover the full story of the Atlantic slave trade, the struggles of the people involved, and the resistance that arose against it, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. By joining us, you will explore history with depth and empathy, learning from stories that shaped the world we live in today. Do not miss out on this journey through one of the most pivotal chapters of human history. As the demand for labor in the Americas surged, the transatlantic slave trade did not operate in isolation. It was deeply intertwined with the political, social, and economic fabric of African societies. Many African kingdoms, far from being passive observers, became active participants in this grim enterprise, often driven by the pressures of survival, ambition, and profit. Within the continent, complex networks of trade and politics had existed for centuries, and the arrival of European traders seeking human cargo intensified these dynamics. Leaders of powerful kingdoms saw opportunity in supplying captives, whether prisoners of war, individuals accused of crimes, or those seized during raids. The lure of European goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, and other commodities added fuel to these exchanges, reshaping traditional alliances and rivalries in ways that would reverberate for generations. Warfare became more than a tool of territorial expansion. It became a means to sustain an economy increasingly tied to the external demand for enslaved people. Local conflicts escalated as smaller communities were drawn into the ambitions of larger kingdoms, often resulting in cycles of violence that provided a steady supply of captives for the trade. Chiefs and merchants alike developed intricate systems to transport these individuals to coastal ports, where European ships awaited. Along the way, these captives were forced to endure arduous marches over hundreds of miles, navigating dense forests, rivers, and hostile terrain, all under the watchful eyes of armed guards who ensured compliance through intimidation and violence. The human cost was staggering. Entire villages could be emptied, families torn apart, and cultural continuity disrupted as people were uprooted from lands they had known for generations. Yet amid this darkness, stories of resilience and survival emerged. Captives relied on networks of solidarity, sharing knowledge and preserving aspects of their heritage even as they faced the uncertainty of being sold into the Americas. These journeys, brutal and dehumanizing as they were, also became the first thread in a transatlantic tapestry that would shape identities, cultures, and societies across continents. European traders, while orchestrating the final leg of the voyage, depended entirely on these inland networks to sustain the flow of human cargo. And so the system became a shared enterprise between continents, though unevenly distributed in power and consequence. The complexities of African participation challenge simplistic narratives. They reveal a world where survival, strategy, and coercion intersected with moral ambiguity, creating a historical reality that defies easy categorization. Understanding this connection between African kingdoms and European traders is essential, for it illuminates not only the mechanics of the Atlantic slave trade, but also the intricate ways in which global economic pressures reshaped societies and set the stage for centuries of human struggle and resilience. This chapter of history, with its interwoven patterns of ambition, conflict, and endurance, demonstrates how deeply interconnected the fates of continents became through the Atlantic slave trade, and how choices made under duress left legacies that continue to inform the modern world. From cultural traditions to the very structures of economies and social hierarchies across the globe. The journey from the African coast to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, represented one of the darkest chapters of the Atlantic slave trade, a continuation of the harrowing path that had begun with capture and forced marches inland. After being seized from their villages or sold by rival communities, enslaved Africans were herded toward coastal ports, where European ships loomed like steel giants against the horizon. The boarding process itself was a moment of terror. Women and children were confined below decks in spaces so tight that movement was nearly impossible. Bodies pressed against each other in suffocating proximity. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat, waste, and fear, and with every passing day, the oppressive environment took a toll on both mind and body. Diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and malaria swept through the holds like invisible predators, claiming lives indiscriminately and leaving survivors weakened and despairing. Malnutrition compounded the suffering, with meager rations barely enough to sustain life, let alone strength. The mortality rate on these voyages was devastating. It was not uncommon for 15 to 20% of those aboard to perish before the ship even reached its destination. Death became a constant companion, a grim reminder of the sheer inhumanity of the system. Yet within this relentless suffering, the human spirit persisted. Many enslaved Africans found ways to support each other, sharing small comforts, whispered songs, and stories of home that preserved identity even as the Atlantic swallowed their familiar world. The psychological impact of the Middle Passage was as profound as the physical toll. Fear, uncertainty, and grief mingled with fleeting moments of courage and defiance, as some captives attempted uprisings, risking everything to seize even a brief taste of freedom. Resistance at sea, though often crushed, became a testament to resilience, revealing that even in conditions engineered to strip them of agency, enslaved people retained a fierce sense of self and community. The journey was more than a transit. It was a transformation, an ordeal that forced individuals into unimaginable adversity while shaping the cultural and social contours of the African diaspora in the Americas. Upon arrival, survivors faced yet another challenge: the shock of dislocation, the abrupt imposition of foreign languages, customs, and labor systems, and the terrifying prospect of being sold to unknown masters. Despite the horrors, the Middle Passage became a formative crucible, forging bonds, shared memories, and cultural practices that would endure generations. The experience underscored the human cost of the trade and illuminated the complex interplay between European greed, African complicity, and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. In tracing this journey, one sees not just the cruelty of the Atlantic slave trade, but the enduring strength of human spirit, a thread that connects past suffering with the resilience and cultural richness of descendants across the Americas today. When the ships finally docked in the Americas, the ordeal of the Middle Passage did not end. In many, it marked the beginning of a new, relentless struggle. Enslaved Africans were sold at bustling markets, their fates determined by the cold calculations of traders and plantation owners. Families were torn apart with cruel efficiency. Parents separated from children, siblings forced into different households, and spouses often never to see each other again. The trauma of such separation was compounded by the harsh realities of forced labor, where the work was grueling, unceasing, and designed to extract maximum profit with little regard for human suffering. Fields of sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton stretched endlessly under the sun, while mines demanded backbreaking toil in dangerous and unforgiving conditions. Despite these oppressive circumstances, enslaved Africans found ways to assert their humanity and retain fragments of their identity. Cultural practices, long suppressed by the demands of plantation life, survived through subtle forms of resistance and adaptation. Songs carried coded messages of hope and escape. Rhythms and dances preserved memories of homelands, and oral traditions kept stories alive that anchored individuals to their heritage. Language became both a weapon and a shield. Dialects and words were maintained within communities even as dominant forces sought to erase them. Spiritual beliefs and rituals endured, blending with new influences to create rich, syncretic traditions that would influence generations to come. Resistance took many forms, ranging from small acts of defiance, such as slowing the pace of work or feigning illness, to organized rebellions that challenged the system directly. Maroon communities emerged in remote regions, where escaped enslaved people built societies that combined survival, autonomy, and the preservation of African traditions. Each act of resistance, whether subtle or overt, was a testament to the resilience of people who refused to be wholly defined by oppression. Even in the most constrained circumstances, enslaved Africans cultivated networks of mutual support, sharing knowledge, skills, and resources to endure daily hardships. The experience of forced labor and cultural suppression also shaped the emerging societies of the Americas. African influences permeated cuisine, music, art, and social practices, leaving an indelible mark on the cultural landscape. Enslaved people, through endurance and creativity, ensured that even under the harshest conditions, fragments of their identity survived, evolving into a resilient cultural legacy that would withstand generations of systemic exploitation. Understanding this period is crucial, not only to acknowledge the suffering endured, but to recognize the strength, ingenuity, and enduring contributions of enslaved Africans, whose resilience laid the foundation for vibrant communities and cultural continuity throughout the Americas. In the face of relentless exploitation, the story of enslaved Africans upon arrival is one of both tragedy and extraordinary endurance, revealing how human spirit can persevere, adapt, and assert identity even under circumstances designed to erase it entirely. It is a story that continues to resonate, reminding us that cultural memory and resistance are as vital to survival as physical endurance, and that the legacies of those who lived through these trials continue to shape societies. Centuries later, the Atlantic slave trade was not merely a story of human suffering and endurance. It was also a cornerstone of economic transformation that reverberated across continents. The profits generated from the capture, transport, and forced labor of millions of Africans fueled unprecedented wealth for European nations and their colonies, creating a financial engine that powered industries, built cities, and financed further expansion across the globe. Ports in cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon thrived as centers of trade, their warehouses filled with goods exchanged for human lives. While shipbuilding, insurance, and financial services flourished to support the vast machinery of commerce tied to slavery. Every stage of the trade, from the acquisition of captives in Africa to the sale of goods produced in the Americas, was carefully calculated to maximize profit, embedding the exploitation of people into the very fabric of economic planning and growth. The wealth extracted from the labor of enslaved Africans did more than enrich merchants. It underpinned industrial development, enabling the rise of manufacturing, finance, and trade networks in Europe that would shape the modern world. Sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations produced commodities that were highly coveted in European markets, generating revenue streams that fueled technological advancements, urban development, and even the establishment of universities and public institutions. This interconnection between human suffering and economic expansion highlights a paradox at the heart of the Atlantic slave trade. The prosperity of nations and the advancement of societies rested on the systemic exploitation of millions, creating economic patterns that would persist long after the trade itself was abolished. Colonial economies were similarly dependent on enslaved labor, with plantations functioning as highly organized operations where every aspect of production was monitored for efficiency and output. The financial gains from these enterprises were reinvested into further colonial expansion, fueling wars, territorial acquisitions, and the establishment of new settlements. As wealth flowed back to Europe, it reinforced social hierarchies and power structures, consolidating the influence of elite merchant classes while shaping policies that favored continued exploitation and control over both human and natural resources. The economic logic of the slave trade created a global system in which the movement of people, goods, and capital was intertwined, generating prosperity for some at the unimaginable expense of others. Even as resistance, rebellion, and eventual abolition disrupted the trade, the economic consequences remained deeply embedded. The structures of wealth, trade routes, and industrial foundations established during this period continued to influence patterns of commerce, labor, and social inequality for centuries. European nations that profited from the Atlantic slave trade became global powers, their economies strengthened by the exploitation they orchestrated, while the descendants of enslaved Africans faced systemic barriers rooted in the legacies of these exploitative systems. Understanding the economic dimension of the Atlantic slave trade is crucial, as it illuminates how interconnected human suffering and financial gain were, and how these intertwined forces shaped not only historical trajectories, but also the very foundations of the modern world. Through the lens of commerce, the story of the Atlantic slave trade reveals the depth of human complicity and the scale of its consequences, illustrating how the pursuit of wealth and power transformed societies, economies, and continents while leaving an indelible mark on generations who endured its brutal realities and those whose lives were built upon its profits. Even within a system designed to strip away freedom, identity, and hope, enslaved Africans continually found ways to resist, asserting their humanity in defiance of overwhelming power. Resistance did not begin on the plantations. It emerged at every stage of the Atlantic slave trade, woven into the story from the moment of capture through the Middle Passage and into life in the Americas. On the ships themselves, where conditions were engineered to crush the will, acts of defiance became dangerous but powerful declarations of agency. Some captives refused food, others sabotaged equipment, and in rare but remarkable moments, coordinated uprisings erupted at sea. These rebellions, though often suppressed, terrified traders because they revealed a truth the system tried to deny. Control was never absolute. Upon arrival in the Americas, resistance adapted to new realities. On plantations and in mines, where surveillance was constant and punishment swift, defiance took subtle forms. Enslaved people slowed their pace of work, passed along forbidden knowledge, or preserved spiritual practices under the guise of imposed customs. These acts may have appeared small, but collectively they undermined the rigid order plantation owners sought to enforce. Songs carried layered meanings, work rhythms synchronized bodies and spirits, and storytelling kept memories of freedom alive. Resistance became embedded in daily life, quietly sustaining morale and reinforcing bonds of solidarity. Escapes represented another powerful challenge to the system. Across the Americas, individuals and groups fled plantations, navigating dense forests, mountains, and swamps in search of refuge. From these journeys emerged maroon communities, settlements of formerly enslaved people who carved out autonomous spaces beyond colonial control. These communities were more than hideouts. They were living expressions of resistance, preserving African cultural traditions while adapting to new environments. Maroons formed alliances, defended their territories, and, in some cases, forced colonial authorities into uneasy negotiations. Their existence proved that freedom, though brutally denied, could still be claimed and defended through collective strength and determination. Resistance also took shape through organized revolts that shook colonial societies and exposed the fragility of the systems built on exploitation. Though many uprisings were met with overwhelming force, their impact extended far beyond immediate outcomes. They spread fear among plantation owners, disrupted production, and inspired others to resist in both overt and covert ways. News of rebellion traveled along trade routes and through whispered conversations, reinforcing the idea that oppression could be challenged. These moments of collective action revealed not only courage but strategic thinking, as enslaved people coordinated across languages, regions, and imposed divisions. What unites these varied forms of resistance is their persistence, despite constant surveillance, physical exhaustion, and the threat of severe punishment. Enslaved Africans refused to surrender their sense of self. Resistance was not always loud or visible. Often, it was woven into survival itself, by preserving culture, forming families where possible, and maintaining hope across generations. Enslaved people contested the logic of a system that sought to reduce them to property. Their actions challenged the authority of traders and plantation owners, exposing the moral and structural weaknesses at the heart of the Atlantic slave trade. This enduring resistance reshaped the history of the Americas. It influenced abolitionist movements, altered colonial policies, and laid foundations for future struggles for justice and equality. More importantly, it ensured that the story of the Atlantic slave trade is not only one of suffering and exploitation, but also one of resilience, courage, and unyielding humanity. Through rebellion, escape, and quiet defense, enslaved Africans asserted a truth that continues to resonate across time. Even under the harshest conditions, the desire for freedom cannot be extinguished. As resistance continued to unsettle plantations and trading routes, a different kind of challenge to the Atlantic slave trade began to take shape across the ocean. By the late 18th century, voices in Europe and the Americas were growing louder, questioning not only the morality of slavery, but also the long-term stability of a system built on coercion and suffering. Religious leaders, philosophers, formerly enslaved people, and reformers drew attention to the contradictions between ideals of liberty and the reality of human exploitation. Their arguments did not emerge in isolation. They were fueled by first-hand accounts of the Middle Passage, the brutal realities of plantation life, and the unmistakable resilience of those who resisted enslavement at every turn. In Britain, public awareness expanded through pamphlets, speeches, and testimonies that exposed the human cost behind sugar and cotton consumed daily in European households. Abolitionists framed slavery as a moral crisis, insisting that no society could claim righteousness while profiting from forced labor. Religious movements emphasized the shared humanity of all people, challenging long-standing beliefs used to justify the trade. At the same time, economic thinkers began to question whether slavery was truly efficient or sustainable, especially as industrialization created new labor systems that relied less on plantation economies. These combined pressures slowly shifted public opinion, transforming what had once been accepted practice into a subject of national debate. Across the Atlantic, similar currents shaped abolitionist movements in the United States and beyond. Enslaved and formerly enslaved individuals played a crucial role, sharing personal narratives that shattered myths of contentment and exposed the daily realities of bondage. Their words carried a power that statistics could not, turning abstract arguments into human stories that demanded recognition. Activists organized networks, petitions, and campaigns that challenged lawmakers to confront the moral and political consequences of maintaining the trade. Resistance on the ground, from uprisings to everyday defiance, reinforced these arguments by demonstrating that slavery was inherently unstable and continually contested. These efforts eventually led to landmark legal changes. Britain's abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 marked a turning point, followed by similar legislation in the United States and other European powers. Yet the end of legal trade did not signal the end of exploitation. Illegal trafficking persisted for decades, driven by profit and enabled by weak enforcement and global demand for plantation goods. Naval patrols attempted to suppress the trade, intercepting ships and freeing captives. But the system proved resilient, adapting to new risks even as it faced growing opposition. The abolition era was therefore not a clean break, but a prolonged struggle between entrenched economic interests and expanding ideals of human rights. It revealed how deeply the Atlantic slave trade was embedded in global systems, and how difficult it was to dismantle structures built over centuries. Still, abolition represented a profound shift in global consciousness. It acknowledged, however imperfectly, the humanity of those who had long been denied it, and set the stage for future movements seeking justice and equality. In linking resistance, economic transformation, and moral awakening, the rise of abolition movements stands as a testament to the power of sustained challenge against injustice. Though the legacy of slavery endured, the abolition of the transatlantic trade marked a moment when voices once marginalized reshaped the course of history, proving that even the most entrenched systems can be confronted and changed through collective resolve. The Atlantic slave trade did not end with the final voyage or the passage of abolition laws. Its influence continues to shape the modern world in profound and lasting ways. Across Africa, the Americas, and Europe, demographic patterns were permanently altered as millions were removed from their homelands and forced into new societies. Entire regions were depopulated, while new communities formed in the Americas, blending African heritage with local cultures to create rich, enduring traditions in music, language, cuisine, and belief systems. These cultural transformations stand as living evidence of resilience, creativity, and survival in the face of unimaginable hardship. At the same time, the economic systems built during the Atlantic slave trade laid foundations for inequalities that persist today. Wealth generated through centuries of forced labor helped propel European nations and colonial societies into global power, while enslaved populations and their descendants were denied opportunities to accumulate wealth. Education and security. These imbalances did not disappear with abolition. Instead, they evolved into social and economic barriers that continue to affect access to resources, representation, and opportunity. Understanding this history helps explain why disparities remain deeply rooted in modern societies, and why their effects cannot be separated from the past that created them. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is also written into social structures and ideas about identity. Racial hierarchies developed to justify enslavement shaped laws, institutions, and cultural attitudes that endured long after the trade itself ended. Challenging these inherited assumptions requires confronting their origins and acknowledging how history continues to influence the present. By tracing the connections between past and present, we gain a clearer understanding of how injustice is maintained and how it can be addressed with honesty and responsibility. Remembering the Atlantic slave trade is not about dwelling on suffering alone. It is about recognizing the strength and humanity of those who endured it and honoring their contributions to the world we share today. Their resilience shaped nations, cultures, and movements for justice that continue to inspire change. Learning this history equips us with the perspective needed to engage in meaningful conversations about equity, reconciliation, and progress. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on its impact. If you found this journey through history meaningful, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of the past. Your support helps keep these important stories alive and ensures that their lessons continue to be shared with audiences around the world.